The city had stood for nearly 2 centuries, perched above the winding banks of the Orontes River, fortified by walls that climbed the mountains themselves. Antioch was not simply a city. It was a statement, a relic of the First Crusade, a frontier fortress that had endured wave after wave of pressure from the Islamic world, and yet remained unbroken. From its towers, one could see both the inland plains and the distant glimmer of the Mediterranean routes. It was a hinge between worlds, between Latin Christendom and the rising powers of the East. And for nearly 170 years, it had survived. But by 1268, Antioch was no longer what it had once been. The strength of the Crusader states had been quietly eroding for decades. What had begun as a unified religious enterprise had fractured into competing interests, dynastic disputes, and fragile alliances. The great victories of the past, Jerusalem, Edessa, Antioch, were now memories sustained more by tradition than by power. The Principality of Antioch itself had grown thin. Its population had dwindled. Its countryside was no longer secure. Trade routes that once sustained its wealth were increasingly contested or lost entirely. Its rulers relied more on reputation than resources, more on inherited prestige than military readiness. And beyond its walls, the balance of power had shifted decisively. To the south, a new force had emerged, disciplined, aggressive, and unified under a leader who understood both war and psychology with equal precision. Baibars had risen from the ranks of slave soldiers to become the Sultan of the Mamluk state. His rise was not accidental. It was forged through conflict, against Crusaders, against Mongols, against internal rivals. He had already proven something few others had managed in that century. He had stopped the Mongols. At the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, Baibars had helped deliver the first major defeat to the seemingly unstoppable Mongol armies. It was more than a victory. It was a signal. The tide of conquest could be resisted. The balance of fear had shifted, and Baibars understood exactly what that meant. He did not intend merely to defend. He intended to dismantle. Systematically, deliberately, and without hesitation, Baibars began targeting the remaining Crusader strongholds along the Levantine coast and inland corridors. One by one, fortresses fell, not always through brute force, but through strategy, cutting supply lines, exploiting weak leadership, isolating cities from reinforcement. He studied his enemies carefully. He knew where they were strong, but more importantly, he knew where they were not. Antioch, for all its historical weight, had become dangerously exposed. Its ruler, Prince Bohemond VI, was not even present in the city. His political obligations tied him elsewhere, balancing alliances with both the Mongols and neighboring Christian states. Antioch, in his absence, was left under local command, defended, but not directed with the urgency the situation demanded, and Baibars noticed. He had a pattern. Before striking, he often used deception, sending letters, offering terms, probing responses, not merely as diplomacy, but as reconnaissance. Every reply, every delay, revealed something about the enemy's mindset. In early 1268, he began to move north. The campaign did not begin with Antioch itself. That would have been predictable. Instead, Baibars advanced through surrounding territories, capturing smaller fortifications and isolating the city from its support network. This was not a siege yet. This was preparation. Villages fell first. Outposts disappeared. Communication lines between Antioch and other Crusader holdings were severed quietly, methodically. Refugees began to move toward the city, carrying stories of advancing Mamluk forces, disciplined, relentless, and increasingly close. Inside Antioch, the mood began to shift. At first, there was confidence. There had always been confidence. The walls were strong. The terrain was defensive. Antioch had endured worse, or so it seemed. But this time was different. The enemy was not disorganized, not divided, not distracted. Baibars did not rush, and that alone created unease. Days turned into weeks. Reports became more consistent. Entire areas around the city were no longer under Crusader control. Scouts sent out did not always return. Those who did spoke less of skirmishes and more of absence, of controlled, silent occupation. This was not chaos. It was design. Within the city, Leadership faced a familiar but dangerous dilemma. To prepare fully for a siege required resources, food rationing, reinforcement of gates, coordination of defenses. But to act too early risked panic, risked admitting that Antioch might actually be vulnerable, and so decisions were delayed, not out of ignorance, but out of hesitation. This hesitation was precisely what Baibars counted on. By the time his forces reached the outer approaches of Antioch, the city was already strategically compromised. It was no longer part of a network. It was alone. And then, only then, did the siege begin to take shape. Baibars' army did not arrive as a chaotic wave. It arrived in formation. Mamluk forces were structured, disciplined cavalry supported by infantry and siege engineers. They had experience, not only in open battle, but in the methodical reduction of fortified positions. They understood walls. They understood time. And most importantly, they understood pressure. Encampments were established with precision. Supply lines were secured behind them. Siege equipment began to appear, not all at once, but steadily, reinforcing the sense that this was not a temporary assault, but a sustained operation. Inside Antioch, the reality could no longer be ignored. This was not another raid. This was the beginning of an end. Defenders took positions along the walls. Archers prepared. Gates were reinforced. Messengers attempted to slip out, hoping to reach Allied territories, hoping to bring relief. But relief was unlikely. The wider Crusader world was fragmented. Coordination was slow. And Baibars had chosen his moment carefully, when Antioch was both politically and militarily isolated. The city that had once been a cornerstone of Crusader power now faced a siege without certainty of rescue. Psychologically, this mattered as much as any weapon. A fortress can endure long sieges when its defenders believe help is coming. It changes how they ration food, how they rotate guards, how they interpret losses. But when that belief fades, something else replaces it. Calculation. Every decision becomes a question of survival rather than victory. Baibars intensified this pressure not only through positioning, but through communication. He sent messages to the city. Not demand for surrender in the traditional sense, but warnings, carefully constructed, emphasizing inevitability, highlighting the fate of other cities that had resisted, offering the possibility of mercy, but only under conditions that implied submission. It was psychological warfare layered over military preparation. Inside Antioch, these messages were debated. To surrender would preserve lives, but at the cost of everything the city represented. To resist would uphold honor and tradition, but risk total destruction. And time, as always in siege warfare, worked in favor of the attacker. Each day, the Mamluk presence became more entrenched, more permanent, more unavoidable. For the soldiers on the walls, the experience was not one of constant battle, but of waiting, watching, listening. They could see the enemy camps growing, hear the construction of siege engines, observe movements that suggested coordination beyond anything they had previously faced. There was no confusion in the Mamluk ranks. That, perhaps more than anything, created fear, because confusion had always been the weakness of invading forces. Disorganization could be exploited. Mistakes could be punished. But here, there were no obvious mistakes, only patience. And patience, in siege warfare, is a weapon. As the days progressed, Antioch found itself not only surrounded physically, but constrained psychologically. Options narrowed. Supplies became more carefully monitored. Discussions among commanders shifted from optimism to contingency. What if the walls were breached? What if no help came? What if this was not a siege to be endured, but a collapse to be delayed? Outside the walls, Baibars observed. He did not rush the final blow, because by the time it came, it would not be against a confident city, but against one already under strain, already questioning its own endurance. And in that space, between strength and doubt, the fate of Antioch would be decided. The walls still stood, but the certainty behind them had begun to crack. By the time the siege settled into its full form, Antioch was no longer reacting. It was enduring. From the walls, the defenders could now see the structure of the force that had come for them. This was not an army gathered in haste. It was a system organized with clarity that revealed experience. Units moved with purpose. Camps were arranged not for convenience, but for function. Supply routes protected, command positions elevated, communication lines unbroken. At the center of this system stood Baibars, not as a distant ruler, but as an active commander. His approach to warfare was neither reckless nor purely aggressive. It was controlled, observant. He had already measured the city before he arrived. Now, he was measuring its response. Antioch's defenses, by contrast, were formidable in structure but strained in coordination. The walls themselves were among the most imposing in the region. Layers of fortification that climbed steep terrain, anchored by towers and reinforced gates. In earlier centuries, these defenses had turned back larger armies. Their design took advantage of both elevation and enclosure, forcing attackers into narrow approaches and exposing them to sustained missile fire. But walls are only as effective as the system behind them, and that system, in 1268, was no longer operating at full strength. Without Prince Bohemond present, command fell to local leaders, experienced but constrained. Decisions required consensus. Responses were slower. There was no singular authority shaping the defense with urgency. This did not mean the defenders were unprepared. Archers lined the battlements. Crossbowmen adjusted their positions to cover blind angles. Reserves were stationed near key gates, ready to respond to breaches or feigned assaults. Supplies, though limited, were rationed carefully. But beneath this visible preparation, uncertainty remained. The defenders did not yet know how Baibars intended to break them, and that uncertainty forced them to prepare for everything. Outside the walls, the Mamluk army began to reveal its method. The first phase was not direct assault, but pressure. Siege engines were constructed within view of the city, deliberately visible. Mangonels and trebuchets took shape gradually, each new machine reinforcing the message that this was a siege designed to escalate, not dissipate. When they began firing, it was not continuous. It was selective. Stones arced toward specific sections of the wall, probing for weakness. Towers were targeted first, not always to destroy them, but to test their resilience, to force defenders to respond, to observe how quickly repairs were made. Every impact was information. Every response was data. From the walls, the experience was disorienting. The attacks were not overwhelming enough to force immediate crisis, but they were constant enough to prevent rest. Each strike carried the possibility of escalation. Each pause raised questions. Was this restraint or preparation? Soldiers found themselves in a state of prolonged anticipation. Fatigue began not from battle, but from tension. Baibars expanded the pressure further. Units were sent to control the surrounding terrain completely. Any remaining access points, hidden paths, lesser gates, informal routes used for communication, were identified and sealed. Scouts attempting to leave the city encountered organized patrols rather than scattered resistance. Antioch was no longer under threat of isolation. It was isolated. Within the city, the effects became more pronounced. Food distribution tightened. Movement between districts was monitored more closely. Civilian populations, already aware of the situation, began to cluster in more secure areas, creating density near central strongholds. This density created its own risks: disease, panic, the rapid spread of rumor. Commanders had to balance defense with order. Too much restriction could trigger unrest. Too little could weaken coordination. And all of it unfolded under the constant presence of the enemy just beyond the walls. The psychological dimension of the siege deepened. Baibars did not rely solely on physical pressure. His messages continued, delivered through intermediaries, through visible displays, through actions that conveyed intent without requiring explanation. Captured territories nearby were not simply occupied. They were dismantled in ways that could be seen or reported back to the city. The implication was clear. Resistance would not preserve Antioch. It would only determine how it ended. Inside, debates sharpened. Some argued for negotiation, not surrender, but delay. Others insisted that the city's history demanded resistance, that Antioch had endured worse, that its walls, its position, its legacy still meant something. But the conditions had changed. And increasingly, the defenders understood that this siege was not about testing the walls. It was about exhausting the system behind them. As the days progressed, The Mamluk operations intensified with precision. Siege engines increased their rate of fire, now focusing on specific sectors identified as structurally vulnerable. Engineers worked behind protective screens, advancing closer under cover at night or coordinated distraction. Sappers began their work. Tunneling beneath fortified walls was a known technique, but it required time, coordination, and protection from countermeasures. The Mamluks provided all three. Covered approaches allowed engineers to begin undermining sections of the defenses, targeting foundations rather than surfaces. Inside Antioch, this threat forced a new layer of response. Counter-tunneling began. Defenders listened for vibrations beneath the ground, attempting to detect the direction of excavation. In some cases, they dug downward themselves, hoping to intercept the attackers before structural collapse could occur. This was warfare reduced to sound and guesswork. Darkness beneath the earth, close proximity, limited visibility, and the constant risk that a single miscalculation could bring down entire sections of the wall. Above ground, the pressure did not relent. Archers exchanged fire across distances that slowly shortened as siege lines advanced. Small engagements broke out near outer defenses, testing reaction times and coordination. These were not full assaults, but controlled confrontations, forcing the defenders to expend energy, to reveal patterns, to adjust positions repeatedly. And with each adjustment, the defenders lost a small measure of stability. Time, which once favored the fortified, was now working differently, because Antioch was not being starved into submission alone. It was being studied, strained, and reshaped by the rhythm of the siege itself. Within the command structure, the weight of decision-making increased. There were no clear victories to reinforce morale, no decisive repulses that could shift momentum. Only a gradual tightening of conditions, a narrowing of options. Reports from different sections of the wall became more urgent. Damage was accumulating. Not catastrophic, but cumulative. Repairs required resources. Resources required time. Time was no longer abundant, and still no relief arrived. The wider Crusader network remained silent, not necessarily out of indifference, but out of limitation. Distance, fragmentation, and competing priorities delayed any coordinated response. Inside Antioch, this silence was interpreted not as delay, but as absence. The defenders began to understand that they were not holding the line for a larger strategy. They were holding it alone. Outside, Baibars adjusted his approach once more. The probing phase had yielded its results. He had identified weaker sections of the defenses. He had observed response times. He had measured the endurance of both structure and command. Now, the siege began to transition. Preparations shifted from observation to execution. Siege engines were repositioned for concentrated fire. Infantry units were organized into assault groups. Engineers completed critical stages of undermining operations, setting the conditions for structural failure. But even now, Baibars did not rush, because the final assault, when it came, would not be against a city at full strength. It would be against a city already shaped by days of pressure, its defenses tested, its leadership strained, its certainty eroded. On the walls of Antioch, the soldiers could feel this shift before they could fully see it. The rhythm had changed. The pauses between bombardments shortened. Movements in the enemy camp became more coordinated, less exploratory. Signals were relayed more frequently. Units began to assemble in ways that suggested not preparation, but imminence. The siege was no longer a question of endurance. It was approaching decision. And inside the city, there was no longer any ambiguity about what that decision would demand. The walls still held. But now, they were being measured not by their height or thickness, but by how much longer they could withstand what was coming next. The moment did not arrive with chaos. It arrived with coordination. In the early hours, before the full light of day had settled across the slopes surrounding Antioch, the rhythm of the siege shifted decisively. What had once been measured, probing pressure now compressed into something focused, deliberate, synchronized, and irreversible. Siege engines opened with sustained fire, no longer testing, no longer selective. Stones struck the same sections of the wall repeatedly, targeting areas already weakened by days of bombardment and undermining. Towers that had absorbed earlier impacts now began to fracture. Masonry that had held under intermittent strain started to fail under concentrated force. Inside the city, the change was immediate. Commanders no longer debated contingencies. They issued orders for response under active collapse. Units were redirected toward the most threatened sectors. Reserves, once held back for flexibility, were committed fully. There would be no second line. The defenders understood that this phase would decide everything. Below the walls, Mamluk engineers completed their work. Supports beneath targeted sections had been weakened, replaced with combustible materials prepared for ignition. When the moment came, fires were set beneath the foundations, heat and structural compromise combining with the impact from above. The result was not an explosion. It was a failure. Sections of the wall gave way unevenly, cracking, sinking, and then collapsing inward under their own weight. Not all at once, but enough to create openings where none had existed, breaches. And once breaches appeared, the nature of the battle changed completely. Baibars had not been waiting for opportunity. He had created it. Assault units advanced immediately, not in disorder, but in sequence. Infantry moved first, carrying shields to absorb missile fire from above. Behind them, additional waves followed, prepared to exploit any foothold gained inside the city. From the walls, defenders attempted to contain the breach. Archers redirected fire downward, targeting advancing formations. Stones, debris, anything available was thrown into the gaps. Close-range combat began at the edges of collapse, where elevation still provided limited advantage. But the geometry of defense had been broken. Walls are designed to channel attackers, to force them into predictable approaches. A breach removes that predictability. It creates space, irregular, unstable, and difficult to control. Inside Antioch, soldiers were now fighting without the structure that had defined their defense. Orders became harder to relay. Visibility was reduced by dust and debris. Units that had operated along fixed positions were now forced into fluid engagement, adapting in real time to incursions that could not be fully contained. At the first breach, resistance held briefly. At the second, it faltered. At the third, coordination began to unravel. This was not due to lack of courage. It was the consequence of compounded pressure. Days of tension had already reduced endurance. Command structures had already been strained. Now, under direct assault, the system began to fragment. Baibars did not commit everything at once. He reinforced success. Where resistance weakened, additional forces were directed. Where defenders held, pressure was maintained but not overextended. The objective was not to overwhelm blindly, but to expand control steadily, turning breaches into corridors into entry points. Within the city, the battle shifted inward. Streets became lines of defense. Narrow passages, once part of daily life, now determined movement and survival. Defenders regrouped where they could, forming localized resistance rather than coordinated fronts. But localized resistance has limits. Without communication between sectors, each position fights alone. And alone, each position becomes vulnerable. Civilian presence complicated everything. Antioch was not an empty fortress. It was a populated city. As fighting spread inward, non-combatants were caught within the movement of battle. Some sought refuge in churches or fortified structures. Others attempted to flee deeper into the city, away from the breaches. This movement created congestion. Congestion disrupted defense. Soldiers found themselves navigating not only the enemy, but the collapse of order around them. The psychological shift, which had begun days earlier, now reached its conclusion. What had once been a question of holding the walls became a question of survival within them. Baibars maintained control. Even within the city, Mamluk forces advanced with structure. Units did not disperse into uncontrolled pursuit. They moved with intent, securing sections, stabilizing positions, preventing counterattacks from reorganizing. This discipline was decisive, because in urban combat, momentum is fragile. Without control, advances stall. With control, they compound. As more sections of Antioch fell under Mamluk control, the defenders' ability to coordinate diminished further. Attempts to regroup were isolated. Signals were lost. Commanders who might have organized resistance were either cut off or forced into defensive positions of their own. By the time organized resistance began to collapse, the outcome was no longer uncertain. It was unfolding. The fall of Antioch did not occur in a single moment. It occurred through accumulation. Each breach, each lost position, each disrupted command, until the system that had sustained the city for nearly 2 centuries no longer functioned. And once that system failed, the walls, no matter how strong, became irrelevant. By the end of the day, control had shifted. The city that had once stood as a symbol of Crusader endurance was now in the hands of the Mamluks. The consequences were immediate and severe. In accordance with the practices of the time and the message Baibars intended to send, the fall of Antioch was not followed by leniency. The population suffered heavily. Structures that had defined the city for generations were damaged, repurposed, or abandoned. This was not simply conquest. It was removal. Antioch would not recover as a Crusader stronghold. Its role in the region, its identity, had been fundamentally altered. For Baibars, the victory was more than territorial. It was strategic validation. The method he had applied, systematic isolation, psychological pressure, controlled siege, decisive breach, had proven effective against one of the most fortified and historically resilient cities in the Crusader world. It demonstrated that strength of walls could not compensate for weakness of coordination. That reputation could not substitute for readiness. And that patience, when combined with precision, could dismantle even the most enduring defenses. For the wider Crusader states, the fall of Antioch carried a different weight. It was not just the loss of a city. It was the collapse of a cornerstone.